Welcome to the AZ Political Podcast. I'm Jim Sharpe. Headline number one. After being forwarded from the House, the U.S. Senate voted to dismiss impeachment charges against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Our Arizona senators, Kyrsten Sinema and Mark Kelly, voted to dismiss despite their criticism of how DHS has handled the border. Headline number two. Arizona Republican Senate candidate Kari Lake brought in $4.1 million in the first quarter of 2024. That's a lot of money, but only a little bit more than half of what Democratic candidate Ruben Gallego brought in. And speaking of Kari Lake, at a Lake Havasu rally this week, she encouraged her supporters to prepare for the remaining 6 months of the 2024 election season by strapping on a Glock pistol or two. And since Lake has been one of the loudest voices making claims about stolen elections, she provides me with a seamless transition to my guest on the AZ Political Podcast, Garrett Archer, who's the data analyst for our TV partners at ABC15. Now, Garrett spent time before being at ABC15 serving as senior elections analyst for the Arizona Secretary of State's office. And you may know Garrett from social media, where he kind of coined the catchphrase Maricopa incoming to let everybody know that there was new election results coming in. So, Garrett, thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate it.
You bet. Also, you're kind of known for your DGJ pictures. That's your son,
yes,
known as Data Guru Jr.
Mm-hmm. Data Guru Jr.
That's, what nationality is your background?
Oh, he's what is
named
it?
Data Junior. Yeah.
Sesame Street. that's what it is. Sesame Street.
So I asked you here on a single mission
yes,
today. First off, well, it's two missions. I wanted to have the bow tie in person.
You got it.
On the AZ Political Podcast.
You asked for it, you get the bow tie.
And I wanted to get to the bottom of the past two elections, 2020 and 2022, and if in any way, shape, or form those elections were stolen, and then to see if there's any way that 2024 can be stolen. So let's start with going back to 2016, actually, when Democrats were using the term election interference, but they were using that term in a very different way than Republicans mean it today, correct?
Very much so, yes. In 2016, Democrats were accusing Republicans basically of media manipulation, is what 2016 was about. They like to use the term Russia, Russia, Russia. So any sort of election discussion in 2016 is largely focused around messaging, and sort of, again, media manipulation. And that is, that's a lot more subjective than what's happened in 2020 and 2024. I mean, you can have opinions on whether the media was overly biased against Donald Trump or whatever. I mean, those are all opinions that you can have, but this is not the same as, again, accusing election officials of systemic, widespread fraud. It's just
actual manipulation of votes as opposed to manipulating the minds of voters.
Yes, you're talking about the difference between something that you can, empirically look at versus something that is sort of more subjective. What are people listening to? What ads are being placed on Facebook? What sort of quote unquote fake news is happening in the newsosphere? Yeah. But certainly not what's happening in our election offices to manipulate actual vote totals. That was not something that happened in 2016 as far as the discussion.
So let's get to what some Republicans have claimed happened in the 2020 election, in the presidential election of that year, and in 2022 in the gubernatorial election here in Arizona. Is any of what they say right? The so-called election deniers?
I mean, you can write a book on at least a dissertation on how many claims have been made against the 2020 and, to an extent, the 2022 election. I like to sort of think of it, my analogy I use is it is darts being thrown at a wall. Several people throwing darts at a wall, hoping something gets sort of close to a target. Some of the more, some of the more simpler but message resonating claims that were made were that there were more votes than voters. Okay, so like you would see this every once in a while. Oh, there was only 133 million registered voters in 2020. How could, if Donald Trump got 76 million, how could Joe Biden get 81 million votes? There was absolutely not 133 million registered voters. There were far more than that in 2020, and that's easily sort of
proven
by just looking at some very basic empirical data. I mean, that's a very simple one. When you go all the way to the other end, you get to very sort of claims that are very technical in nature, usually dealing with the network security of election machines, using a lot of cybersecurity and networking acronyms that the average American has no idea what they are.
And you're barred from using at all today.
Oh, yeah, I won't use any of them. Using very specific sort of claims on network security and leaving out the part that these election machines are not on the internet. And so you can't exploit you can't hack a machine that is not on the internet. You just can't do it.
Right.
So, and then you also have the absurd, which was things like the election results were manipulated by a server in Germany, where all the results from Smartmatic, I think it was Smartmatic, was the claim, sent all the results to Germany, and then they got filtered back here.
Didn't I hear something about satellites too?
That's part of that part. That's part of that claim. So I mean, those are just three. That goes from the simple to the technical to the absolutely absurd.
So was there any place, any of the claims made by, once again, I'll say the so-called election deniers, any of their claims that were made that were like, okay, yeah, you know what, that actually happened, but it wasn't big enough to actually change the results of the election?
So it's funny you put it that way, because let me focus on one of the other larger claims that were made that had a lot of resonance with the people that did believe that there was some sort of shenanigans going on, and that was 2,000 mules. If you recall, that specific claim was that there was a massive systemic ballot. There was basically ballot harvesting. There was this groups of in their minds, partisan Democrats that were collecting votes from people nefariously, illegally, and then driving to certain ballot drop-off zones and dumping all these ballots into these drop-offs, and that this was a massive movement across the country.
And they proved this by tracking cell phone technology.
Yeah, and they said that they proved it by tracking cell phone technology. And so this was huge. I'm sure that a lot of people that are in politics, or at least pay attention to politics, at least know when I say 2,000 mules, know what I'm talking about, at least what it was. And, that claim, for example, a couple things about that. It's been picked apart multiple times by multiple people, going all the way to my favorite pick apart on this about debunking 2,000 mules is simply that they were so lazy that they didn't even bother getting the latitude and longitude coordinates of the drop boxes correct. So everything that they say about everything they say about these claims, they hinge upon where these drop boxes are located, because they're like, hey, we tracked everybody to the drop box. It's like, well, you guys, this drop box was actually placed a mile away from where you say it was. That basically negates everything that they say. So that being said, ballot harvesting, which is sort of a term that has a little bit of a negative connotation to, but in some states it is a legal thing to do.
Right.
There are some states in which it is legal for representatives of groups, both Republicans and Democrats, to go out and collect ballots from citizens as long as they are in sealed envelopes and nothing is changed, everything's signed, and then bring them back to drop-off locations. That in some states that's legal, in some states it's not. In Arizona, it's not legal. Now, where I'm going with this is that just because it's not legal doesn't mean it doesn't happen on a very small scale. Like, for example, there was a case in Yuma where some vice mayor did some ballot collection for her little race in I think it's San Luis, very tiny town in Yuma County, to do some ballot collection there on a very small scale. So small scale ballot harvesting can actually occur in places that is not allowed to happen. I'm sure it does. But as far as the level and complexity that would be required to change the results of an election, it's just not even close. Not to mention the fact that, as I tell people before, like, even if it does occur, so even if someone says, we found this group of 100 individuals in Maricopa County who've collected 1,500 ballots from registered voters who signed it, sealed it, and gave it to them. That ballot is a completely legal ballot, even though what the person was doing is not legal.
Right.
The ballot itself was not tampered with. It is still sealed. You can still tell that it was not tampered with, and thus it is a legal ballot. We don't. I like to tell them we don't punish in child trafficking. We don't punish the trafficked child.
Right.
That ballot is a legal ballot. I'm sorry. You don't get to say no, it's not, because it was collected illegally.
Well, and wouldn't you have to have X-ray vision to know who they voted for?
Exactly.
In that sealed envelope?
Yeah.
So you might be throwing away or stuffing the ballot box, and I hate to even use that term, with somebody that you wanted them to vote for or not vote for.
So then we move into sort of the conspiracy world, because now, in order to validate this theory, you now have to have a situation in which you could say, well, there's evidence of people collecting opened ballots, unsealed ballots, and taking them into a central location, or filling them out themselves and then casting the ballot. There's absolutely no evidence of that, especially at scale. Nothing. And
you have to be at people's mailboxes?
You'd have to be at people's mailboxes. You'd have to go and talk to a bunch of people. You think that, say you were trying to get people's unopened mail and you need to do it at scale, you think you have a situation in which 10,000 people, households, were asked to give an unsealed, unopened envelope, and we have not one report to law enforcement, not one report to the election officials, nothing from any household saying, hey, someone came up to my door and asked for my unopened mail. And they offered me $10 for it, but I care too much for that. So I'm reporting this to law enforcement because this is not right. Like, not one report of that. Come on. I mean, let's be real here. Yeah.
So has anything changed between 2022 and 2024 as far as election law goes? Let's talk a little bit about that. But what I mostly want to talk about is it possible for 2024 to be stolen based on what we've seen in the past?
You know, the claims that have been made are so completely not based in reality that even if you take these claims and bring them to a logical conclusion, they're not worth anything to anybody who wants to steal the next election. It's just, there's really nothing there. There's so many mitigating factors that election officials use to contain any sort of pervasive election fraud that there's just the only, I mean, really, when you see actual, so like people will point to the Heritage Foundation has a database of election fraud, but actually it's voter fraud. That's the thing, is it's voter fraud, not election fraud. And there's a big difference because voter fraud happens at the voter level. Right. And so will there be situations where a overzealous individual, both Republican or Democrat, may cast a ballot for their their deceased grandmother or deceased mother that really would have voted this way anyway? Will that happen? Yeah, it probably will. Will it happen at scale? Absolutely not, because after a certain period of time, you would start to pick up on this, and again,
a lot of dead relatives.
And there's a lot of dead relatives, and like, while there are some instances in which there are dead people on the voter rolls, it's not as many as people think there are. And we know this because we've had some of these the sort of overzealous, again using that term, election integrity people have submitted data to the county saying, hey, all 500 people of I checked a database, and these people are dead. And then, the county will actually take this roll and say, no, like one of these people are dead, or 30 of these people are dead, based on the HHS rolls that you don't have access to because there's private information there. Right. So 30 of these people are dead, and one of them did vote. That's not a good thing because they weren't supposed to vote. So there will be those kind of situations, but again, it's not nowhere near as pervasive as anyone wants to, or some people hope it is, I guess. Well,
and what's interesting though is that Donald Trump continues to say that the election was taken from him illegally, and yet more than half of the Republican Party has supported him in the primaries that have taken place across the country. Do you feel, however, that there's people that are like, you know what, I don't believe Trump on this, but I'm just backing him anyway because of his economic policies or his foreign policy or any of that stuff? And have you seen what you believe to be a shift, at least in minds, that, all right, we've argued this enough. I think we're really past the point where we believe the election was stolen. He lost, but I'm still supporting him.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely people in both groups. I mean, I've got people in my own family.
But my biggest question is, do you see a shift in those people?
I see.
Do you see more of those people being in existence now?
I would say that the number of people that ardently believe that the election was stolen has shrunken considerably. It's sort of, they've evolved from, I believe the election was stolen, to, well, there's probably issues with our election system or transparency, so thus we should, do X, Y, and Z to fix it. So that's sort of how they've justified it in their mind to switch over from, I believe there was active fraud, to this passive belief in that the election system has some sort of holes in it.
Right.
I think that's sort of where the shift has happened the most. People, there's not going to be a lot of people out there that are going to adjust their political beliefs that much over this sort of sentiment. There's a lot of people they have longstanding beliefs on how they've been Republicans for decades. Not a lot of them are going to switch to Democratic on a long-term basis in service of saying, well, these guys say that there's election fraud, so I'm not going to vote for them. At least that's the way sort of I see it. I could be wrong there, but I think the polling shows that I'm not. So
and is your belief that this is occurring, that there has been a shift, at least in the general mindset, based on fewer people arguing with you on Twitter?
Yeah, I'm definitely. I basically have the usual suspects now. The people that either have a stake in the election fraud grift, or people that are just, they're so partisan that, we all have them in our lives. Just that uncle that's super partisan at the dinner table.
Yeah.
So, and to an extent, just wants to argue for the sake of arguing. So, you're just always going to have those people. There's going to be people out there that say we need to have the one vote, in small precincts,
on the day of the election.
That is I guess, on its face seems like a respectable sentiment to have, but it's one of those things where I don't think they really truly understand the complexity of that. The amount of issues. Even if you believe that early voting is inferior to election day voting, and there's going to be people that feel that, and that's totally fine. But you must understand, if you believe that the amount of logistics that it would take to have hand count vote centers in a county the size of Maricopa is nearly impossible. The amount of people they would have to hire and on a fairly temporary basis, we're talking tens, almost hundreds of thousands of people just to be trained to count elections.
Wow.
And it's just not tenable. There's not enough. There's no evidence that any of the machines were tampered with in order to justify going to a full hand count. These machines, yes, the machines, they tabulate the final results that we use to canvass the data and to certify the election. But there are multiple hand counts that happen in the background. If you talk to an election official, Stephen Richard, how many hand counts do you guys do? I mean, they're doing hand counts every day during the election early vote period. They get a batch that comes in. They've got Republicans and Democrat observers there, and they'll sit there and okay, let's do a hand count of this batch. And then they'll do a hand count of an early vote batch, and they'll say, okay, it came out to X and Y, and then they'll tabulate that batch, and it will match X and Y. Boom. And they do that all the time. It's not just that one final statutory check.
Right.
They're doing hand counts constantly to make sure that everything is on the up and up. Elections seem like it's very simple, that it's just, you're just counting up numbers, but there's so many undercounts under that sort of goes into that final count.
Yeah, no, and there's so many offices that are, it's not just counting the presidential election or the Senate.
Oh, yeah.
So, you've got the county elections that are coming up.
People love to tell me, they're like, well, look, France counts their entire vote in one night. It's like, well, okay, France is counting one contest. That's
right.
That's I don't know how many registered voters are in France, but let's just say there's 10 million. Okay, so there's 10 million votes for France's president that they have to count. Seems like a lot, yeah. In Maricopa County alone, if you sort of undo a ballot so it's just contest, there's about 110 million votes that need to be counted.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And machines aren't partisan.
No.
Human beings are or can be, and I think that opens all sorts of other Pandora boxes.
Well, and that's why, election officials and everyone understands that people can be partisan. So they have people watching. There's people watching at every layer in this process. There's somebody watching the ballots to make sure that everyone is on the up and up. So, I mean, there's just so many checks to make sure that that everything comes out as accurate as possible.
Okay, so I want to check the boxes before we let you go.
Sure.
2020 wasn't stolen.
2020 was not stolen.
2022 was not stolen.
2022 was not stolen.
And 2024 can't really be stolen.
Will not be stolen.
Okay.
It's just not really. It's not a feasible thing. If you come to me and tell me about some small mayoral race in Kansas or San Luis, I'll say, there's a possibility that there's going to be some monkeying around somewhere where it could impact a race of, where 500 people vote and it's going to be separated by 30 ballots. But when we're talking about even if we're a close race in Arizona, less than 1%, that's still tens of thousands of ballots. It's tens of thousands, and it's so difficult to do that. That's why dictators, they don't win by 1%. Dictators who manipulate the vote, like Russia, Vladimir Putin won by 95% of the vote. There's a reason when elections are manipulated, truly, that the person who's manipulated wins by such an insane margin. Right.
Well, I just want to make sure that we checked all the boxes. The mission was accomplished today, including seeing the bow tie in person. Is that one that you tie yourself?
I always tie my own bow ties.
Nice. Yes. Solid. Because I was going to say the last time I wore a bow tie was when I got married, and that was one of those ones that you just hooks in the back.
Yeah, no, the story of the bow ties is when I was working down at the Capitol, there's a lot of 20-something, I'm not 20-something anymore, but when I was working down at the Capitol, there was a bunch of 20-somethings, in ties and suits. And so I'm like, you know what? If I'm going to go to these fundraisers or go to these things, I'm going to wear a bow tie. So at least they'll be like, oh, yeah, it's the guy with the bow tie.
Yeah, it's kind of the George Will look.
And I've just kept it from them.
I like it. All right. Garrett Archer from ABC15. He's a data analyst and was formerly the state, help me out here.
Senior elections analyst. Okay. The only elections analyst at the Secretary of State's office.
Okay. Very good. And certainly the only one to wear a bow tie. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Garrett. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, Jim.
As I mentioned at the start of our AZ Political podcast, the campaign of Republican Senate hopeful Kari Lake raised about $4.1 million in the first 3 months of 2024. And I mentioned that wasn't a bad haul until you place it up against what her likely opponent in the fall, Democrat Ruben Gallego, brought in during the same time period. More than $7.5 million. Lake's campaign cash looks even smaller when compared to Gallego's cash on hand. Lake's campaign said that they had about $2.5 million in the bank after paying bills. Gallego started April with more than 3 times that amount, $9.6 million. But it especially looks puny when you compare it to the hundreds of millions of dollars expected to be spent on campaign advertising in Arizona this year. Yeah, it's more than a drop in the bucket or a bathtub poured into Lake Havasu, but a small enough amount that it might be hard for her to cut through all the campaign clutter with the presidential race, congressional races, and even some county level offices in the 4th most populous county in the country. They're all being contested. I mentioned Lake Havasu specifically because at a rally held in that western Arizona town this week, Kari Lake said something that many took her to task over. She told her supporters that they should maybe, quote, strap on a Glock, just in case. Here's where I would be expected to say something corny like, Kari Lake shot herself in the foot by saying that, but I really think continuing to never let go of the idea that she was robbed in her race for governor in 2022, something we discussed with Garrett, is what will lead Kari Lake to take her campaign out behind the barn and put it out of its misery. Because continuing down that road will mean fewer and fewer people shooting cash her way. That's it for our AZ Political Podcast. Thanks again to Garrett Archer from ABC15, data analyst, for joining us here. And I will see you next week on the